Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Carrie Anderson, production editor for TNSR. What follows is a discussion between Marshall Kosloff with the Clements Center for National Security and Frank Gavin, who is the chair of TNSR's editorial board. They discuss Frank's essay in TNSR called Cracks in the Ivory Tower.
Frank Gavin, welcome to Horns of Dilemma.
Great to be here.
It's great to chat with you. So, as chair of the editorial board of the Texas National Security Review, you open every issue with an essay, the latest of which is titled Cracks in the Ivory Tower. Rather than starting with the problems of higher education, which I'm sure lots of folks in the audience have heard a lot about, I'd love for you to just begin where you actually began in the essay by actually saying the positive role that higher ed has played in your life and a lot of where the potential for the institution really lies.
Absolutely. And it's great to be here. I think in my own life, access to universities and higher education has been transformative. As I mentioned in the essay, I came from a family that didn't have a steep background in higher education or universities. Basically, your sort of classic working class immigrant, Irish Catholic Philadelphia family. And some people went to college, but it was usually a local Big Five college, and it was for perhaps a business degree, but most people didn't. And so when I became interested in the sort of issues that come up in higher education, it was unusual for me. I didn't really have any background in this. I ended up going to the University of Chicago, which is an extraordinary institution, and it opened my eyes to the possibilities of learning and identified for me universities as almost a sacred space for people to come together, to wrestle with, to think about and debate really complex and difficult ideas, both about the natural and physical world, but also our social and political world, and to innovate, to generate new insights, but also to return to the same questions that have tormented and entertained human beings from time immemorial about who we are and what we're doing.
And I'd love to hear about how you really critique some aspects of higher education through the context of failing to answer a central question, which is the purpose. What is the purpose of higher education and learning?
So I think it's important. One of the things, I'm a historian, and though I critique contemporary higher education, it's also important to remember both its accomplishments and its history. Institutions of higher education have existed throughout the world for quite some time, during the medieval period, and sort of really taking off in the Renaissance and early modern Europe. Research universities really began and just sort of exploded. And you've got the great examples of Bologna and Oxford and Cambridge and things like this. And these seats of learning were great places for people to come together and debate and wrestle with ideas. But I wouldn't want to suggest that they were ever apolitical or ever without their flaws. During my time at Oxford, who saw all sorts of historical examples of how both Oxford and Cambridge had to wrestle with the Civil War in England during the 17th century and how politicized things were and how to take sides. You also saw at that time, or a little bit earlier, many of the great scientific and engineering revolutions that took place in, say, navigation did not take place at places like Oxford or Cambridge. They took places at places like Gresham College, a small kind of bootstrap institution that was located in London. So the first thing to say is that universities, just like ideas, are always going to be far from perfect and often politicized. The modern American university really takes off in the late 19th and early 20th century, using successful German universities as a model. The University of now, Johns Hopkins, was a real tone setter on that front in the United States, as was my alma mater, University of Chicago. when universities started to embrace what might be thought of as more scientific rigor, that the results of the scientific revolution in understanding, explaining, and even controlling the natural physical world was, of course, one of the most profoundly important things that happened in human existence. And people started to think we should be able to apply those principles, those insights to the social, cultural, political, and economic world. And that's where you get the rise of modern disciplines, political science, economics, anthropology, sociology, and even in history, a more kind of rigorous scientific turn. And that change generated enormous advances and really made American universities the leading universities in the world. Now, part of that was the sort of the misfortune of Europe, where many great thinkers, intellectuals, scientists left war-torn, Nazi-ravaged, intolerant Europe and came to American universities. But the American universities in the post-war period were just extraordinary. Spent some time at MIT, and when you walk around MIT, you sort of see that MIT as an institution was about as important to winning the United States winning the Second World War and the Cold War as any institution that you'll see. In recent decades, however, I think the university has kind of gotten off course in a bit. There's been a divide between the natural and physical sciences and engineering on the one hand, the professional schools on another, like law and business and medicine, and then the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences, which were once the kind of core of the modern liberal university. And it's in that latter category, and as a historian, it's the one that I'm most familiar with, where I think the modern university has sort of kind of gone on a less than productive path. The final thing I'll say is that given the spiraling costs of higher education, the general notion of assessing and evaluating universities by vocational, career, and income sort of consequences and outcomes has been the measure that people have used to judge whether a university is successful or not. And I think that can be a problematic measure, particularly in a world right now where the United States generates more wealth than any society that's ever existed, but is deeply polarized, riven with all sorts of sense of conflict, a lack of social cohesion and common purpose, which often turns around issues that universities had once been actively involved in thinking.
One of your previous editorials for the TNSR was titled Dark and Stormy, and it was really your reflections on the perilous moment in the international political system that we all find ourselves in. I'm curious to your point around MIT playing this key role during World War II and the immediate post-war Cold War era. What do you see as social science specifically providing a space or answers for navigating the questions of this present moment?
Right. And I think this is one of the interesting things. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, I was not a history major. I became a historian later. But history could be taken either. There were 4 schools at Chicago: the physical sciences, biological sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. And most disciplines were firmly in one. History was the only major that you could take either as a humanities or a social sciences. And the only difference was if you took it as a social science, you took a stats class. And if you took it as humanities, you took a second language. And what this reflected for me was history's sense of it didn't know whether it was humanities or social science. It was both or either. And it reflected a kind of a larger issue, which is that the human community has, over the last several centuries, made unimaginable progress in understanding and even harnessing the natural and physical world, both to protect humanity from the vicissitudes of nature, and then also to harness nature in the physical world for human benefit. Now, it's had all sorts of consequences, many of them negative, from developing weapons of mass destruction to the climate crisis. But for the most part, human beings live longer, are healthier and safer, largely because of this revolution. Those principles, when applied to how human beings interact with each other, and how human communities interact with each other, and how human beings think about their relationship to both the larger world and their community has been far less successful. And I think that is because the nature of those questions, who we are, what we should be, how we should live, don't necessarily lend themselves to the same methods that allow us to construct a longer and safer bridge or put a plane into flight. And I think those kind of questions, which are the questions human beings have wrestled with since the earliest times of civilization, are often final kind of answers solving for X the way you would in constructing a building or flying an airplane, elude us. And it's frustrating. And so oftentimes we don't ask those questions, or those questions become easily politicized, or they become controversial. And we've lost the habit, the muscle memory of creating places where we can debate and wrestle with together these important questions, recognizing that they're not like an engineering problem necessarily going to be solved, but in the very act of debating and discussing them and recognizing various perspectives and finding common purpose when we can is really one of the crucial roles that learning and scholarship and universities can play. And that's where I think the social sciences and the humanities in recent decades have really failed us.
And that lets me kind of jump to the end of your essay where you talk about generative AI. AI is obviously a specter that haunts higher education in many industries in many ways. But I think what you just said around these questions not being STEM problems gets at why you think AI isn't going to get all the way there or completely replace or can maybe serve as a supplement. I'd like to talk about that section of your thought.
I had the great honor privilege of getting to know Dr. Henry Kissinger while I was running the Kissinger Center. And he passed away late last fall. And he spent a good part of the last decade of his life thinking about and wrestling with the question of what artificial intelligence would do, not just to questions of international security, but just sort of this notion that there's an entity that can reason separate from us. And he did a lot of work with Eric Schmidt on this, and it's fascinating, important stuff and should be studied. I guess, though, when I think about generative AI, it's training on data that is created by human beings. And therefore, it reflects the prejudices, instincts, uncertainties, and questions that human beings have. And while generative AI can do extraordinary stuff on correlation, well beyond the ability of a human being to make correlations, as far as I can tell, it can't really do causality. It can't do why things happen. But even if it could do causality, it can't do teleology. What is the end? What is the purpose? What is the meaning? What is the direction of the things we do? Because those are human questions. And they're, in some ways, by their very nature, unanswerable. And the wisdom we get is from wrestling with them and debating them with others. And there is no solving for X in those. And so, I barely know how to use my iPhone, so I could be completely wrong about this. But my sense is this obsession with the ability to take enormous amounts of data and to create information does not necessarily generate knowledge, and it certainly doesn't guarantee generating wisdom. And that's, I think, where we should look at the consequences. We should see how it can be harnessed to our benefit while its danger is minimized and recognized. But I do think this debate is missing this larger question. Most of our disagreements, most of our sense of unease, one of the things I mentioned in Dark and Stormy was we live in this golden age of amazing students. And at a time where we have the smartest students in the world who are doing all these great things, the level of anxiety and uncertainty and, frankly, pessimism about the future is not a question of technology. It's a question of wrestling with these core issues of what it is to be human, what a person's purpose is, what its person's relationship is with a larger collective entity. It's a person's relationship with a community, with history, with any number of the questions. And I don't really see, perhaps I'm missing it, how AI actually helps with those core issues.
A quote you offer in the piece that I found actually very motivational from a what are we trying to do here perspective was learning is about who you should be. You write in the piece. And I think if we're looking at a lot of the challenges to higher education, especially from the 2010s onwards, the MOOCs, the massively online, open courses, the alternate models of higher education, debates around STEM, I think at a core level, while they could challenge some aspects of the higher education status quo that feel broken, the cost, the lack of scalability, the credentialism, they can't actually get at this question of who you should be. I'd love to kind of get your perspective on this who you should be question, because if I'm thinking back to my education as an undergrad, I don't remember thinking about that question or having anyone framing it that way.
Yeah. And this is, again, I was very lucky to go to the University of Chicago, where they have, and I believe I mentioned in the piece, you start out your university education with a speech called The Aims of Education. And it's your first week at the university, and a professor is selected to talk about what they believe the purpose and point and end of education is. And then you return usually to your dorm to discuss it. And it's a wonderful tradition. And you can go to their website and see how different people have thought about it. Because there is no one person is going to have a definite view on what the point and aim of education is. But actually arguing and wrestling about it always struck me as a very healthy way to kind of get at these issues. And the University of Chicago is a kind of a unique place. It's a little different. It's much larger than it was when I was there, but they still do this aims of education, and they still have a common core. And I think it's around the idea that you should create an environment where smart young people from varying backgrounds can come together and wrestle over big questions. And, the kind of learning that goes on in the dorm room late at night during bull sessions over what people read or learned or thought, which happens at a time in your life when you're also wrestling with these bigger questions of who you are, what your relationship is to the world, on all sorts of issues, is really, really important. I mean, you remember this from being in college. When you're 18, 19, or 20, you were thinking about issues like love and friendship and identity and purpose and loyalty and meaning. And it's manifesting itself in strange and difficult ways. But there's nothing in an accounting class or a computer science class that's going to help you navigate that. But if you're wrestling with a great work of fiction or philosophy or history, regardless of what society or time period it came from, it can help you as you navigate that. And if you've shared that text with others and friends, it gives you sort of a place for all of you to come together and wrestle and argue with these things, about these things. And that's the thing that I think is missing. Now, to be fair, University of Chicago was unique. It's not like other places at other times thought about education that way. But I think as I've been thinking about the problems, particularly American society is facing, I do think, particularly thinking about this lecture on Erasmus, that kind of pedagogy, that kind of wrestling with ideas and thoughts through philosophy and fiction and art and history, it doesn't give you a manual for how to become something or how to behave, but it gives you the tools to ask the right questions, which I think we are often missing in our current educational environment.
Taking us back to the national security part of the Texas National Security Review's title, if you are thinking of undergrads that you may encounter or that are listening to this podcast ideally, what are some broad national security related questions they should be contemplating and thinking about in this space?
Let me give you an example of how this approach might be effective. Right now, I think an issue that's most people would identify, at least in the United States, as the greatest national security challenge is the rise of China and the relationship between China and the United States. And if you were interested in this question, perhaps you would take an international relations course or get a degree in international relations. You'd look at a variety of theories about how rising and falling powers behave and try to apply a scientific or a quasi-scientific approach trying to understand these questions. And that might generate some insights. But I also think as you kind of step back at it, you would want to ask yourself, why is it that China and the citizens of China view the world the way they do? What do they see as their relationship both to their larger political entity, to each other, to their own history? And I think if you were to do this, you might find that the kind of more universalistic scientific models of explaining world politics could be at times misleading. If you grow up in China and you have a different sense of meaning and purpose and historical direction, even of temporal horizons and time lengths, you might view the world differently. A good friend of mine and Jim Steinberg, who published a terrific piece in Texas National Security Review, who looked at how in different countries in East and Southeast Asia, the history curriculum and the understanding of their past affected their current worldviews, which shaped their policies. And the only way you can understand that would be to actually understand those varying historical perspectives, those different views that's imbued in these countries of purpose, mission, direction, the relationship between the individual and the collective. Questions and issues that are often hard to capture in kind of more universalistic social science IR models. And so that's kind of the example of the sort of, by being aware of and conversant in these debates and discussions about meaning and purpose and historical direction, you would also understand that different societies at different times had different ways of viewing these things. And that might manifest itself in different policy preferences. And it doesn't mean, and I said this in a different TNSR review, but it doesn't mean you have to agree with those perspectives. But if you want to succeed in the world or avoid a war, it's pretty important that you understand them. And that's the kind of, say, historical sensibility and understanding that I think that's probably better generated through a liberal arts education of the kind I talked about in this essay than kind of a more hardcore social science or even law training, where those kind of historical differences of perspective often get sort of shaved away or aren't really fully appreciated.
So here is how we'll close the conversation. You start the piece off by going to your biography. Like, once again, you're a higher education outlier when it comes to your family and the experiences as you rose through academia. One of the big themes of this current political moment is probably the gap between, let's say, like the Ivy Tower elite-centric view of foreign policy questions and just the broader populace at large. How should this field consider itself as it meets this moment?
So that is a really great question. It's a very important question because I think, as you highlighted, the educational divide is one of the most important predictors of, say, political and cultural difference, and not just in the United States, but around the world. And I think what I can say here is that it is natural, but unfortunate, for universities and those associated with them to assume both that they have all the knowledge of the world and then to treat those who aren't participating or part of their world as somehow needing direction or kind of beneath contempt even. And I think that the great promise of education, and especially higher education, and particularly in the United States in particular periods, is to provide a platform for anyone of any background, regardless of economics, race, ethnicity, and to come together, and where those previous categories become less relevant, and all that matters is wrestling with difficult, important ideas and concepts in a vigorous but respectful way. And the university, when it's at its best, it is a place for people of all different backgrounds and perspectives to come together and really have at it and fight over ideas that are very important, and recognize at the end of the day that maybe you're not going to convince everybody, but if people come to the debate respectfully and honestly, they should not only respect the views of others, but they learn from them. And I think too often universities have become repositories of, I guess for lack of a better term, elite thinking, which is really lazy thinking. Universities work best when what matters is the quality of ideas, not where they come from, not who says them, and not even whether they make you feel comfortable or not. And so I think universities need to do a much better job. This, by the way, gets to the concern about universities just being judged by producing vocational outcomes, because universities are too expensive, and that excludes lots of people who don't have the means from going to them, from participating in them. You know, when I went to the University of Chicago, I was not from a poor family, I was not from a rich family, but they provided me with plenty of aid and loans, and I worked. And I think my family would not have been able to send me to university. The family then would not have been able to send me to the University of Chicago. And I think that's unfortunate. So part of this has to do with the attitudes that universities have of being too looking down upon people. Part of this has to do with the economic proposition if it's too expensive for people to come. And part of it has to do with a general disconnect that has happened in society between different parts of society. And I think universities, were once a place that people from different backgrounds could come together and be judged solely on the quality of their ideas. And I think we want to return to a world where universities become like that again, that no one who doesn't have a great idea or is interested in the same way that I was as a young person in wrestling with these ideas, that it's open to anyone who's willing to think, to write, to be creative, to argue vigorously, but also respectfully, and to be willing to listen to ideas that are different than theirs. And I think that spirit, which, I do, I'm not Pollyannish about it, but I do think American universities in the Cold War period, they certainly had certain problems, but they had elements of that. And for any number of reasons, we've lost that. And hopefully we can return to that spirit once again.
That is a helpful and optimistic place to end. Frank, thank you for joining me on Horns of a Dilemma.
Thank you, Marshall. It was great talking with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.